Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Purdy Podcast, Discover the Joy. So this is like a follow-up to the last podcast that I did just a couple of days ago with my coworker, Matt. So very quickly, you gotta watch it because it really is dynamic. So Matt stubs his toe at home, gets a cut or an abrasion, takes care of it himself, no big deal. Well, it was a big deal. And like a week to 10 days later, his foot starts turning black. So he goes to the hospital. He has his leg amputated above the knee. And you got to listen to it to hear what happened and how that all came about. But he talks about coming out of these dark places where he's had to deal with, his whole life changing because he now doesn't have a leg. Matt is at the beginning of his journey there, trying to figure out what life has in store for him. And we are talking about how he got himself up out of those spaces. With me is Carol Visconti. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate that. She's a licensed mental health counselor with Baptist Health. She's been practicing for 16 years. So she's going to give us some insight into what works and what you can resort to help just uplift yourself. And we're going to start with Dan because where Matt is starting in his journey, Dan represents where Matt will be eventually. Dan Nevins, a motivational speaker. He's a military veteran. He's a double amputee, and he speaks all over the country for outlets everywhere and motivates them. And I'm going to let Dan tell us what happened to your legs.
Well, for me, it was a combat operation outside of a place called Balad, Iraq. It was in the middle of the Operation Phantom Fury, which was in Fallujah. I wasn't in Fallujah. It was mainly a Marine Corps effort, but there were coordinated assaults everywhere. And we did this, it was supposed to be a 72-hour dismounted counterinsurgent operation to handle some of the insurgency that was coming up to our area of operations. And we left at 0400 hours in the morning, so 4 o'clock in the morning, on what was supposed to be a 72-hour counterinsurgent operation. And then not even a kilometer down this canal road that was en route to what was supposed to be our dismount site, where we were going to get out and go conduct this operation. Just en route on that canal road, and then boom, the silence of that morning was destroyed by the deafening blast that sent my little over 18,000-pound vehicle in the air in a ball of fire.
An IED?
An IED, exactly.
Improvised
explosive device. Yeah.
And when you landed, were you thrown out of your vehicle? Were you in still?
Yeah, yes. Right?
I'm sure you probably don't even remember.
No, exactly. I do. I actually lost maybe a couple of seconds. So when the explosion happened, I could feel and hear the truck disintegrate around my body. And when I opened my eyes, I might have been knocked out for a couple seconds. I realized that I was ejected from the vehicle and I'm laying in the dirt. This silty, like powdery dirt that's all over the Tigris River, right where I was. And my legs were still attached, but stuck in the vehicle. The explosion had turned the bottom of my truck inside out and trapped my legs in the vehicle. I mean, they were shattered, but also trapped and still attached. And so I was,
see your legs.
The only thing I really couldn't, because it was 4 o'clock in the morning. It was pitch black outside. And we're all in night vision and the whole thing, but my helmet came apart in 2 pieces in my hand. Don't really know where I am at this moment, but I'm just trying to do my best to figure out what was happening. And what the real injury that I found out was it was 2 155 millimeter artillery shells that blew up underneath my feet. And it killed my buddy Mike, who was driving. It's who I wear this bracelet for. So the blast got all of Mike and my legs. And then so the real damage was the shrapnel from those artillery pieces ripped through my thigh, cut my femoral artery completely in half. My femur was intact, but everything on the medial side of that femur was completely sliced open. And so I just had to reach my hand in there and try to stop the bleeding. And, I was pressing on it, praying that it would give enough time for my medic to arrive. And then my medic, Dan Smee, showed up. I was losing what seemed like all of my blood. And I knew I was going to die. I was making my peace with God. I was saying goodbye to my family. And I just remembered my, they say your life flashes before your eyes. I'm sure you've heard that before. That wasn't my experience. It was more like a slideshow of all the things left undone.
Oh, wow.
And like to be accomplished, and like I was like saying goodbye to those things. But I remember the last thing, and I can't remember what they were. The last one I remember, it was my daughter. She was 10, but she was all grown up, dressed in white, walking down the aisle without her dad. And I shot up. I was like, Dan, I'm alive. And I just reached my hand in that wound and tried to stop the bleeding. And then my medic showed up. I blinked my eyes, and there was a tourniquet on my leg. I blinked again. One of my team leaders was putting an IV, not even a medic, putting an IV in my arm to restore my blood volume so I could hopefully live for the flight back to the hospital. And I did. They kept me alive. And I wound up at the Combat Surgical Hospital right on LSA Anaconda, where I had just left maybe 10 minutes before. And then the amazing combat medical team saved my life. I woke up from that with, I'll never forget it, a combat nurse's face right in mine as soon as I opened my eyes. And I'm in a hospital tent. Like, it's a really nice tent. But
It's got to be a tent.
right. It's a really nice one.
Okay.
And but she's right in my face. It's like she didn't want me to look without telling me something
Want you to
first.
look around at your body. Ugh.
And so she said, Sergeant Evans, you're a very lucky man. We managed to repair your femoral artery. We had to take your left leg below the knee. We managed to save your right one for now, but you'll probably lose that one too. And she was right. After 36 different surgeries and 2 years in the hospital trying to save that leg, ultimately I had to take it off. I chose to take it off, but it was the absolute correct choice.
And those hours, those days that followed, when all of this is sinking in, that your life has changed, just like my buddy Matt's.
Right.
What is going through your mind? I mean,
Well, for me, it was like, you go from, I was the most physical fit I've ever been in my life. I was kicking in doors and chasing down the bad guys. Like you're living like, I'm 8 feet tall and bulletproof, barrel-chested freedom fighter, whatever whatever cliche thing you want to say about it. Like that's how I felt. And I went from that to broken and useless and laying in a hospital bed and angry that, like Mike, who was a mentor of mine, one of the best human beings in the world, died. I'm like, well, wow, you're wrestling with all of those things. But if I were to isolate, and that makes any situation of healing harder, but to isolate just my legs, I was going through traditional body image issues. Like the back of my mind, like, okay, I was a competitive runner. Running is what brought my wife and I together. Well, how was she going to love me anymore? And then my 10-year-old, she's 30 now, by the way, and I got to walk her down the aisle. And then that jerk made me officiate her wedding. So I had to walk her down the aisle, a teary mess, and then just give her away, and then officiate the wedding. It was, I'll never forgive her, but I also love her immensely for that opportunity. But I was going through that in those moments, like, okay, I lost one leg and probably the other. What can a guy with no legs do? And if I put myself in Matt's shoes, like I still have my knees, which is a huge blessing. And so like if I'm...
Why is that a blessing? Does that help you maneuver better?
Exponentially better.
Okay.
Because everything, to lift my leg, to retract it, everything is in my complete same control as it always has been. Now, if Matt wants to lift his toes, he can't. So he has to learn different ways to get up and how to safely know that it's like a whole... I know when I put my foot on the ground, I can feel it. Matt can feel it, but not in the same way. I know that if I put pressure and stand up, I'm going to stand up. Matt will have to readjust to everything. I'm at a hospital surrounded by other people who are also wounded. Some of them missing legs above the knee, some bilateral above the knee, some triple amputees. And then I wasn't there for any quadruple amputees, but there have been at least 3. And so someone is always dealing with more than you are. And all you have to do is look in the physical therapy room and you see someone smile who's missing 2 legs above the knee and most of their right arm, their dominant arm. And you're like, well, if he's smiling, then I have no excuse not to. And so that type of atmosphere really brings people up.
Now, see, that's interesting that you had other people to look at and look to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were talking about my buddy Matt. When he came out of rehab for 3 weeks and was home, and now you have to go to PT, you've got to get up and go do stuff. He was by himself during the holidays in his apartment. He didn't have anybody. You know, but he looked to people online. He looked at other amputees. And how important is that? He said, you know, speaking to people like you, like doctors, and he called them shrinks. He said it was great. He said that was great, but it was so much more meaningful because he had other people who had the same injury, the same thing happen with their limbs. How important is it to find people that you can keep your sights on?
It's a support group. It's being able to communicate with people that are going through the same events that you're going through. I think one of the underlying things that I see in any type of excuse me, life-altering or life-changing event is that you grieve what you used to be or what your expectation was prior to the life-changing event. But you don't realize you're grieving because you're angry, as Dan had said. Yeah. You're in fight or flight. You're not even at a point where you can process anything, and that's where being entrenched with people that are going through the same thing as you allows you to have that outlet. As Matt said in his interview, which I found very profound, he said, I had it together, and boom, I fell apart, and I ugly cried, and I was like, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So that's okay. Do you encourage that?
It's actually needed because crying is a release. It's an emotional release. Think about what for anybody who doesn't have, everybody has a life-changing event at some given point in their life, but when you ugly cry, 5, 7, 10 minutes, and afterwards you're a little bit exhausted, but you feel better. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because you've purged everything that you've been holding inside. So yes, I would encourage crying all the time. Happy, sad, regardless.
Well, there was also something that he said. He said people kept telling him to look forward, stop looking back on what happened. But how can you not? I mean, do you forget about what happened and move on, or do you remember? I don't know. What do you do?
I think there's a place for that in time. I don't think you have to process what you've gone through, and there's steps to that process, and it's not an algorithm. It's what works for each individual. The most important thing, yes, you will get to a point where the windshield in front of you is bigger than the rear view mirror behind you. Very true statement. But there still is the rear view mirror, and we're not trying to forget it because it's what's making you what you are today. You have to learn how to process to get through it so that it doesn't take over your world.
So Dan, you went from military vet to motivational speaker to places all over the country. Right. What the heck? How in the world did you even get out of where you were?
I got lucky. So there's I'm a yoga teacher now, but I resisted yoga in the beginning because I didn't think that was for dudes. There's a book by somebody you might have heard of, Bessel van der Kolk, called The Body Keeps the Score. So it talks about, and I had read this book, and it talks about how when we don't process emotions, we don't grieve, we don't have the purge cry, we will store that unhealed energy in our body. And it sounds all kind of hippy-dippy, but in my experience, it's 100% correct. And I saw this motivational speaker say that feeling bad for yourself is a choice. Like everything's a choice. And then if you want to feel better, you can just choose to feel better. And then it takes work, right? The light switch doesn't go off. But in the hospital bed, when I'm feeling terrible, I'm like, this is my life. I lost one leg. I'm probably losing this one. Okay, that's not changing. So what, am I just going to be upset and just mad and bitter? That's not who I actually want to be. I actually want to be someone who lives life and does those things and goes skiing and mountain climbing and whatever else. And so I made the choice. And then put in the work to allow that choice to manifest.
And that's what Matt said too. He made a choice. He was in the corner of the room, and the first thing he did was open his blinds and just let that Florida sun come in. I mean, he's like, it's kind of stupid, but I mean, it worked.
Yeah.
Why does something like that work? It wasn't anything miraculous that he did.
And when I was watching the video, I was like, no, that's not stupid. Like I'm saying, no, I'm like, that's perfect, So I always try to explain that a life-changing event's like an umbrella. And so that umbrella is the event. And our brain says, how do we get out of this? Or how do we switch it? Or how do we get wherever we want to get? As you said, you make a choice. You can't verbalize that you're going to change something without taking the steps to get there. But don't look at the umbrella as a whole. Take each spoke at a time. Give yourself, first of all, give yourself the grace to move forward, take a few steps back. Move forward again, take a few steps back, which is exactly what Matt was doing. He opened the blind in therapeutic and psychological words. It literally, when the sun goes through your eyes, it increases your hormone of serotonin, which is a mood stabilizer. So whether you have depression or anxiety or both, which typically in a life-changing event, people have both, it stabilizes your mood, which allows you to get to the next step. So when you open a blind, as menial as he thought that was the first step. It helped his serotonin increase. So then his next step was, I'll go get the mail. Perfect. That's your next step. Doesn't have to be huge things. Let it be small. And then you build on them. And then you start to redirect the way you think from the negative or the victim mentality or why me mindset to, okay, like in Matt's case, he snowboarded. So his brain is saying initially, I can never snowboard again. Not the case. Just going to be a different way of snowboarding. Now I got to learn how to snowboard this way. And so that's what the goal is. Very small steps. Set yourself up to succeed. Give yourself grace through the whole process. Understand, like anybody, you can wake up and have a really bad day. One of the things he said about PT was, I had no idea how I was going to get through it. I didn't think I was going to be able to handle it.
His physical therapy, yeah.
Yep. He said, but I got up and I went. He said, I just showed up. And I was like, again, he said, I don't know why I did it. And I was like, this is perfect, because that's all you got to do. Just put yourself out there and then allow the people that you're surrounding yourself with to help you along.
That's got to be a challenge. Dan, when you've gone through something traumatic, you don't have both of your legs. You went through all that you went through in the military, on the field.
Right.
People just in general, in the world, in the spaces that you come in contact with, they don't get what you went through. They hear you, but they don't get it.
Right.
So how do you get back into society, get back in there, get back to your family, get back to your friends? Your friends are like, hey, Dan, come on, let's blah, blah, blah. And, you may not feel like it. So how did you...
It's actually it's a real challenge because it's not just, one, they don't know what it's like to be an amputee, and two, they don't know what it's like to be wounded in the way. And I'll say this too, because I wanted to say this earlier, but my squirrel brain went crazy, is in order to heal, you have to actually forgive yourself too. So a lot of people in the military, why did I sit in that seat? For me, why did I have to get in that truck, sit in that seat to make this my lot in life? Or why did Mike have to drive? Maybe if there was a different driver, we wouldn't have hit that. There's all these things. And while none of it's in your control, you still have to go, I have to go back and forgive all the people involved. Not for them, that's even the people who planted the IED, right? Because, if I were them, I would probably be planning an IED too. You have to put yourself in their shoes and be like, okay, I forgive that person. Not really for them, but for me.
To allow yourself
myself to move past it, like get rid of any attachment to the negative feelings or the anger or the bitterness or whatever, and to move past it. And I'm sure in Matt's case, he's like, oh, maybe I should have gone to the doctor sooner.
Yeah, he never went for checkups.
Maybe I should have, how did I not know I had diabetes? Maybe I should have been taking better care of myself. Whatever that is there's a lot of really beneficial things you could do looking back a little, but the windshield's bigger, they got to continue to drive forward. But to your question, with that, everyone's sort of coming and they don't know what to, I feel sorry for them. Like, they're like, hey, you want to go, no, not skiing. Do you want to walk it? No, you don't want to walk. Do you, there's all these,
people don't know what
they
to
don't
say
know what
or
to say
do.
or how to be. And you just have to be like, it's okay. Like, it's all right. Just say whatever. And then I'll make fun of you for inviting me to go on a run, right? Like, and give me that chance to make fun of you, or like to make you feel bad in a way. Like, for instance, I'm a fairly decent golfer with no legs, and I'll be practicing on the range. And over here, I live very close to the stadium course at TPC Sawgrass, so people come from all over. And I'll be hitting shots on the driving range, and inevitably somebody will say, oh my God, you're hitting the ball so well. They're surprised. Not really better than anybody else, but for a guy with no legs, right?
Which they never say,
Right,
but
I know exactly what they mean. They're like, wow. And they go, you're hitting that ball so well. What's your handicap? And I go, I don't have any legs, a-hole. And they're like, oh, and they're mortified. And then I let them off the hook, right? But they're like, you have to find those moments to sort of break the ice with people. And then let people know that you're actually okay. Like, you can call me Legless Wonder if you want. You can, whatever. Like, it doesn't, well, that's just a very military thing. I don't know. Like, in the military, we make fun of each other in the worst possible ways. That's how we show love.
Gotcha.
Like, it is. It's how we'll insult you and your family, and that means we love you. If you treat them with dignity, respect, and perfection, that means you're not very well liked.
Gotcha.
In a lot of circumstances, there's difference when you're going up the chain of command.
Yeah,
clearly,
right. But amongst your peers.
And I
I'll
get
say it like
that. My
way.
husband's a police officer, retired police officer, and they had the same mindset.
Got
and
it.
the jokes that went on, you were just like, oh my gosh, that was really offensive. And you were surely you hurt that person's feelings. You're like, ah. So I get that.
Yeah.
But how do you get to the place where you're even comfortable with someone else being uncomfortable? You know, I mean, you go somewhere and you're with your friends, but you've got stares. And Matt said, I can feel you staring at me, and that weighs on you a little bit. But, you know, how do you deal with that? You're already dealing with stuff on the inside of yourself. Now you got to worry about everybody else.
It's a process. It's a process. So you're not going to be out doing those things when you're in another arena of your healing. You take it step by step.
So you're saying you wouldn't even be in that public space,
right?
Until
you're at a point where you have to become comfortable with yourself,
Right.
And then you get to the point where you're like, all right, now I'll make other people comfortable with me.
Gotcha.
Well, and then people, like, you have to just know, like, I knew, like, I don't have legs. I have robot legs to kids. So they're going to stare. And so it's like, you just have to, like, for me, I had to accept the fact, like, okay, if I was perfectly able-bodied and 12 or 15 or 30 and saw it, I might be like, whoa, that's something, and then I might stare because it's my natural reaction without any insult behind it. Just that's, and then so for me, being the person stared at, I'm like, well, they're just doing what I would do.
Yeah.
It doesn't make them a bad person. And then I might be like, especially early on when I was like learning and it was painful to walk up steps, I'd be like, sorry, I just got to get through this. Like, you give my little apology to, like, I'm going slow, I know, but I got to get to the top of these steps. And then that winds up inspiring people. You know, so it's sort of like you have to give space for the reality of life. Of like, wow, that's different, so I'm going to stare. You have to just allow it to happen, know it's going to happen, and then find a way to be okay with it.
Do you still have ugly cries?
I don't know. The only ugly cries I get is when I storyteller, and I'll tell the story the worst day of my life, and I will get emotional, like I'll get misty, but it's never about what people think, like, are you okay? And I'm like, no, I'm actually, the reason I moved to tears is remembering how amazing the people in my life were. Like when I talk about Mike, who was killed, and I'll talk about him, and it was a pretty gruesome sight, and I can see the picture of what that looked like, horrific. But I can see it. There was nothing left of bitterness and anger. It's all just love and admiration for who he was as a human being, the lessons that he taught me, and I still get to talk to his kids. You know, like those. I get a little emotional right now even thinking about the humanity, the love, the sort of greatness of those moments. That's what moves me to tears. It's not anger, bitterness. It's the same reason you well up at some commercials, like that really pulls you. It's that same feeling.
And to be able to find those things and keep your mind focused on that
On the positive,
when you start slipping back has got to be difficult too. But I'm sure that, I mean, what else can you do? You know?
That's why they say when people will say, "Oh, just let it go." No, give yourself the moment. And I would even say to people, if you give yourself the grace, give yourself a few minutes, let yourself process whatever's happening in that moment. We can't dictate what's going to happen from day to day. But say, oh, okay, I'll embrace whatever's happening. I'll give myself 5 minutes, and then I got to get to yoga. I got to get to work or what have you. So it's a matter of normalizing over time how you feel, accepting who you are, and being happy with the redesign, for lack of better phrases. Being proud of the redesign and taking that positive energy because it's so contagious. So contagious.
And I know we could talk about this forever, but I do want to make sure that people understand, okay, you may not have lost any limbs, but maybe you lost your mom. Or maybe you just got fired from a career that you spent your entire life doing. Or, you know, whatever that bad news is, there are resources out there for everything. You just have to reach out and look. And I know for you, one of those places was Wounded Warrior Project.
Absolutely.
How did that group specifically help you?
Well, they were the first ones. Two of the founders came into my hospital bedside with a backpack full of comfort items, all the things that I didn't even know I needed, and a promise that whatever I needed, they'd be there for me and my family. And in those early days, this is back in 2004, the organization was brand new. They didn't have any money. And, you know, these founders were living off of their retirement funds, trying to do the right thing for a whole generation of warriors. And they had the right idea and the right mindset. They didn't have money. But what they did, to the point that we talked about even with Matt, is they showed up every day. They just showed up at the hospital and listened. And so they were listening to all the emerging needs of this new type of warfare, this new generation of warfighter, and then started saying, well, then I think we need to do this. And adaptive sports was one of the first things. And Matt was talking about snowboarding. And I was so grateful to hear him say he's been in touch with some of these adaptive sports groups, because I was like, I'm going to put him in touch with these adaptive sports groups when I'm listening to it. Right? Yeah. And so they all they did was show up and listen and then say, we're going to do this. And then they found a way to raise the money to do it later. And what Wounded Warrior Project has become, you talked about it, whether it's you lost your job or whether you're dealing with a physical wound or some emotional, invisible wound, whether it's from war or childhood or whatever it is. I think what Wounded Warrior Project, one of their biggest assets, well, it's their logo. It's one warrior carrying another off the battlefield. And we all start as the person on top being carried. And then ultimately, the goal is to transition to carry somebody else. And Wounded Warrior Project has created communities of warriors, and it's like a meeting place for those when you can't be in a physical therapy room and look across and see somebody worse off than you smiling. They'll bring people together at events, silly little, like I'm going to go to a leather workshop in a couple days just to be around other warriors. And I'll probably wind up being inspired, but then hopefully maybe somebody who's having a worse day can be like, oh, I'll get a little inspiration from just being around people who might be on a brighter side of their injury. And so that's a real powerful thing that Wounded Warrior Project is. It's a networker. It's a front porch for vets to gather on.
And they kept showing up and they listened. How do you help someone? You know, everybody at my work knew Matt was coming back the next day, and you know, it's like, okay, what do we say? What do we do? What do you do for someone who is struggling?
You just be there. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to be present.
Don't try to fix them.
Exactly, because you can't. What really is happening to them is out of your control, but what you can control is actually just being there. If somebody breaks down, just tell them it's okay. Something as simple as when somebody called me the other day and said, I'm so sorry, I'm crying. I knew the minute I heard your voice I was going to cry. And I said, well, then that's what my purpose is right now. Nobody knows. But you're never going to know how you can help without just being present for them. And they kind of tell you over time, you know, that it just all meshes over time. It's just a matter of taking the time, being actively listening and actively present with the person is what they need. They don't need your answers because they know you don't have them, or they would have them.
And it's so, you know, you say that, and the thing that popped into my head is when my dad was dying. He was very active in his church, and people didn't know what to say, so they stopped visiting him.
Exactly, because they're uncomfortable.
And so the one person in this mega church that came to visit him came with just a pair of razors to cut his hair. And it was like a lot of nervous talk and a lot of, you know, he was just talking, he was just saying stuff. Right. And my dad reached over and grabbed his hand and didn't say a word and just looked at him. And he was just happy he was there.
He was there.
So that's so important, just to, you know, hey, I don't know what to say to you, but I'm here.
And that, to your point, that's even very important to say. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, but I know being here can help. And they'll tell you.
And especially in a work environment as well, right? It's sort of like, instead of what I've seen work, a lot of people go, hey, so I don't know what to do with you now that you're disabled or you're whatever. It's sort of like, no, I'm going to hold you to your work product. And if you need something, let me know. Put it back. Like, everybody wants to feel empowered and they want to feel like they need to figure it out. And so you also have to give them a voice and say, hey, you got to tell me what you need. But otherwise, you need to make sure all these things are done.
The event does not change who they are as a human being. And I think if people recognize that and realize, okay, so Dan doesn't physically look the same, but he's still the same person, has the same personality. There's just been an event that he had to process on his own.
Carol, Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to Wounded Warrior Project for putting me in touch with Dan, and to Baptist Health for connecting me with Carol. The next time you see me will be in 2 weeks on the next episode of the podcast. Yes, May 28th. Because that's what I have time for. And we are going to talk about caregiving. I'm in that sandwich generation where I have kids, a family, and I'm also overseeing my mom's care. A caregiver, how do you find one? How do you look for one? What can you afford? What if you don't think you can afford one? What will somebody be willing to do to help you out, to give you some relief in taking care of your loved one? We're going to talk about that next, so see you in 2 weeks. Oh, why am I wearing a dress with a baseball cap? Because I am headed to work, and it's a little kind of rainy out, and this does not do rain. See you in 2 weeks.